The June afternoon had settled over St. Mary Mead with that peculiar golden quality that makes English villages appear in photographs like something out of a nostalgic dream. The vicarage garden was at its finest, with roses climbing the old brick walls and delphiniums standing like blue sentinels along the herbaceous borders. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, had been planning this garden party for weeks, and the weather had cooperated magnificently. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary chair beneath the oak tree, her knitting needles moving with steady precision as she observed the gathering with bright, interested eyes. To the casual observer, she appeared to be nothing more than a harmless, elderly lady enjoying the sunshine, perhaps a bit too interested in the comings and goings of her neighbours. Those who knew her better understood that very little escaped her notice. Asked young Lucy Clement, approaching with a silver tray. "How thoughtful, my dear." Miss Marple's eyes followed the vicar's daughter as she moved away, noting the girl's anxious glances toward the garden gate. Expecting someone, Miss Marple thought to herself. A young man, no doubt. The party was well attended, as vicarage events generally were in St. Mary Mead. Colonel Bantry and his wife Dolly had arrived early, the colonel already looking rather red-faced in the heat. Mrs. Price Ridley, resplendent in an unfortunate shade of purple, held court near the refreshment table. The Harmon sisters, Lavinia and Harriet, fluttered about like a pair of elderly butterflies, dispensing gossip with the same enthusiasm as Mrs. Clement dispensed tea. "I do hope Mrs. Fortescue arrives soon," Mrs. Clement was saying to a small cluster of ladies. Mrs. Price Ridley's voice carried across the garden. "How curious!" Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. Gossington Hall had stood empty for nearly 2 years since old Mr. Fortescue had passed away. His widow, Sylvia Fortescue, lived there alone with a minimal staff, hardly the setup for entertaining house guests. The gate clicked open, and several heads turned expectantly. Sylvia Fortescue entered the garden with the careful dignity of a woman who had learned to bear her widowhood as one might bear an uncomfortable but necessary garment. She was perhaps 55, still handsome in a faded way, her dark hair showing distinguished threads of silver. She wore a summer dress of pale green that had seen better days, though it was scrupulously clean and pressed. Behind her came a woman Miss Marple had never seen before. The stranger was younger than Mrs. Fortescue, perhaps 40, and dressed with a quiet elegance that spoke of London rather than the countryside. Her suit was of excellent cut, a soft dove grey that set off her auburn hair. She wore pearls that even from a distance Miss Marple could tell were genuine, and her shoes were polished to a high gloss. Everything about her suggested money, taste, and a certain guardedness. Mrs. Sylvia Fortescue's voice was warm, but carried an undertone of strain. "How lovely everything looks! May I present my guest, Mrs. Helena Vane?" Mrs. Clement bustled forward with effusive welcomes, and Miss Marple observed as introductions were made. Helena Vane smiled appropriately, said the correct things, but her eyes, sharp, assessing eyes, were taking inventory of everyone present. When those eyes briefly met Miss Marple's, there was a flash of something. Recognition? Apprehension? The moment passed too quickly to be certain. The two women accepted cups of tea and began to circulate. Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Fortescue seemed anxious, her hand occasionally touching her guest's elbow as if to guide or perhaps restrain her. Helena Vane, for her part, maintained a pleasant expression, but there was a brittleness to her manner, like fine china that might crack under pressure. Colonel Bantry had approached Miss Marple's chair, squinting across the garden. "Used to know her people years ago," Married some fellow named Vane, I believe. Miss Marple's tone was mildly encouraging. Wealthy chap, something in shipping. The Colonel lowered his voice. Can't think what she's doing staying with Sylvia Fortescue. Miss Marple filed this information away, as one might file a newspaper clipping. Potentially useful, but requiring verification. Her eyes returned to the two women, who had paused near the rose arbor. They appeared to be having a disagreement, though both were maintaining polite facades. Mrs. Fortescue's face had gone rather pale, and she was shaking her head slightly. Mrs. Vane's expression had hardened, her smile fixed and meaningless. The Harmon sisters descended upon Miss Marple like a pair of determined pigeons. Lavinia Harmon began breathlessly. That's Helena Markham, I mean Vane, the one whose husband died so suddenly, Harriet finished, equally breathless. Oh, dreadful talk, Lavinia confirmed with relish. Though nothing was ever proven, of course. Heart failure, the doctors said. But he was a robust man, not old at all by today's standards. Barely 60, Harriet interjected, and the will was very much in her favor. Everything left to her absolutely. Miss Marple made a gentle interrupting noise. Now, we mustn't repeat unsubstantiated rumors. The sisters looked slightly abashed, but not particularly convinced. They drifted away to share their knowledge with more appreciative listeners. Miss Marple's attention returned to the garden, where a small drama was unfolding. Dr. Haydock, the local physician, had arrived and was making his way toward the refreshment table when he suddenly stopped, staring at Helena Vane. His ruddy, cheerful face had gone quite still, and Miss Marple saw him take a step backward, as if he'd encountered something unexpected and unwelcome. Mrs. Vane had seen him too. For a moment, neither moved. Then Dr. Haydock deliberately turned away and headed for a different part of the garden. Helena Vane's hand had gone to her throat, where it rested against her pearls. Lucy Clement had returned this time without the tray, her young face troubled. That would be lovely, dear. You look worried. The girl glanced around before lowering her voice. It's just, well, I couldn't help overhearing Mrs. Fortescue and her guest earlier, before they came in. They were standing just outside the gate, and Mrs. Fortescue was saying something about, you promised, and this is blackmail. And Mrs. Vane said, she stopped, looking uncomfortable. Miss Marple's voice was kind, but interested. She said, call it what you like, Sylvia. Lucy's eyes were wide. It's difficult to say, dear. But Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly. Blackmail was an ugly word, and if true, it cast an entirely different light on this visit. She watched as Sylvia Fortescue moved through the party with jerky automatic movements, her smile strained. Whatever burden she carried, it was growing heavier. The afternoon progressed with the measured pace of such gatherings. Sandwiches were consumed, gossip exchanged, and the vicar made his usual rounds, being benevolent to everyone. Helena Vane remained at Sylvia Fortescue's side, though the connection between them seemed more like that of jailer and prisoner than guest and hostess. It was nearly 4 o'clock when Mrs. Vane excused herself. "I'm afraid I have the most dreadful headache," she announced to Mrs. Clement. "Would you think me terribly rude if I went to lie down for a bit?" "Of course, my dear Mrs. Vane," the vicar's wife said sympathetically. "The summer house is open." Miss Marple watched as Helena Vane walked across the lawn toward the small octagonal building at the far end of the garden, half hidden by a screen of lilacs. She moved with purpose, her earlier brittleness replaced by what looked almost like satisfaction. 20 minutes passed. The party began to show signs of breaking up, as garden parties do when the tea has been drunk and the sandwiches consumed. Mrs. Clement was discussing the upcoming church fete with Mrs. Price Ridley when Lucy came running across the lawn, her face white as paper. "Mother! Mother, come quickly! Something's happened! It's Mrs. Vane!" The girl's panic silenced the garden. Everyone turned to look. The vicar asked, moving toward his daughter. Dr. Haydock was already moving, his medical bag somehow in his hand, though Miss Marple hadn't noticed him fetching it. The vicar followed, and then others began to stream across the lawn, that terrible fascination with disaster overcoming propriety. Miss Marple rose from her chair more slowly, her knitting tucked into her bag. She noticed that Sylvia Fortescue had not moved. The woman stood frozen near the rose arbor, one hand gripping the wooden support so tightly her knuckles had gone white. By the time Miss Marple reached the summer house, a small crowd had gathered at the door. Dr. Haydock emerged, his face grim. "I'm afraid Mrs. Vane is dead," he said quietly. The murmur that ran through the crowd was like wind through leaves. Shock, excitement, fear, all blended together. Mrs. Price Ridley's voice rose shrilly. "But how?" De Haydock's expression was carefully neutral. "I cannot say at this time." But Miss Marple, standing at the edge of the crowd, had caught the doctor's eye for just a moment. And in that brief exchange, she understood what he was not saying. Helena Vane had not died of natural causes. Miss Marple turned to look back at the garden, at the scattered teacups and abandoned chairs, at the faces of her neighbors showing various degrees of shock and curiosity. Her eyes found Sylvia Fortescue, who had finally moved and was making her way toward the summer house like a woman walking in a nightmare. Somewhere in this pleasant English garden, among these familiar faces, was someone who had committed murder. And the game, as Miss Marple sometimes thought of it in her more analytical moments, had begun. The summer house had been transformed from a charming garden retreat into something far more sinister. Inspector Slack arrived within the hour, his motorcar sending up clouds of dust as it came to an abrupt halt before the vicarage. He was a sharp-featured man, with an unfortunate tendency toward premature conclusions, something Miss Marple had observed on previous occasions when their paths had crossed. The guests had been asked to remain, though most had retreated to the vicarage proper, where they clustered in small groups, voices hushed but urgent. Miss Marple had positioned herself in the morning room, ostensibly to be out of the way, but the location afforded an excellent view of the comings and goings through the French windows. Dr. Haydock emerged from the summer house with Inspector Slack, their heads bent in conversation. Miss Marple could not hear the words, but she could read the doctor's expression well enough. He looked troubled, more troubled, she thought, than one might expect from a medical man who had merely discovered an unexpected death. "Poison," Mrs. Price Ridley announced, with grim satisfaction settling herself onto the sofa beside Miss Marple. "Mark my words, it will be poison." "What a dreadful thought," murmured Miss Marple, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "My dear Miss Marple, it's perfectly obvious. That woman had enemies. You could see it in her face. Too confident by half, too well dressed for a simple garden party in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple privately reflected that Mrs. Price Ridley's logic was severely flawed, but she simply nodded encouragingly. People often revealed more when they believed they had a sympathetic audience. Across the room, Sylvia Fortescue sat alone in a wing chair, her face a mask of carefully controlled emotion. She had refused tea, refused companionship, and now stared at her hands as though they belonged to someone else. Miss Marple noticed that she had removed her gloves. They lay discarded on the side table, and that her fingers were trembling slightly. The door opened and Inspector Slack entered, his eyes sweeping the room with professional assessment. "Mrs. Fortescue." Sylvia rose mechanically, moving like a woman in a trance. As she passed Miss Marple's chair, she stumbled slightly, and Miss Marple reached out a steadying hand. "Thank you," Sylvia whispered, her voice barely audible. Up close, Miss Marple could see that her eyes were red-rimmed. Whether from tears or sleeplessness was difficult to determine. "Courage, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. Sylvia's laugh was bitter and brief. "Courage? Yes." She followed the inspector from the room. The moment the door closed, the whispers began in earnest. "I heard," Lavinia Harmon said, leaning forward conspiratorially, "that Mrs. Vane wasn't really a friend at all. Someone said they'd overheard her threatening Mrs. Colonel Bantry looked skeptical. "Not at all," Harriet Harmon interjected. "Young Lucy told her mother she'd heard them arguing before they even entered the party." Miss Marple's needles continued their measured clicking, but her mind was filing away each piece of information, examining it from different angles like a jeweler appraising stones of uncertain value. Dr. Haydock appeared in the doorway, looking weary. His eyes found Miss Marple, and after a moment's hesitation, he crossed the room to stand beside her chair. "A terrible business," he said quietly. "Indeed. You knew her, I think, Mrs. The doctor's jaw tightened. "I knew her. Long ago when she was still Helena Markham." He paused, seeming to struggle with some internal debate. "I should speak with Slack. About Mrs. His voice was grim. Helena Markham was beautiful, charming, and utterly ruthless when it came to getting what she wanted. Dr. Haydock gave Miss Marple a sharp look. "You see everything, don't you? Yes, I avoided her. 25 years ago, she nearly cost me my career and my reputation. I was a young doctor, newly qualified, and she—" He stopped abruptly. "But that's ancient history. I'm certain of it. The symptoms were unmistakable. The cyanosis, the contraction of the pupils, the distinctive odor. Slack is sending for the police surgeon. But I'd stake my professional reputation that she was poisoned, and recently." Miss Marple considered this. "The headache powders, perhaps?" "Already thought of that." The packet was unopened beside her chair. He shook his head. "I must speak with Slack." As the doctor departed, Lucy Clement slipped into the room, her young face drawn with distress. She made her way to Miss Marple's side and sank onto the footstool beside her chair. "Miss Marple, it's so awful. I keep thinking, what if I'd gone to check on her sooner?" "My dear child, you mustn't torture yourself." "From what, doctor?" "But who would do such a thing?" Lucy's voice dropped to a whisper. "Do you think it was Mrs. Fortescue?" "What you overheard," Miss Marple said gently, "was only a fragment of a conversation. We don't know the context, and we certainly don't know what drove those words." Lucy didn't sound convinced. "Inspector Slack has been questioning her for ages, and she looks so guilty, Miss Marple." Miss Marple set down her knitting and took the girl's hand. "Guilt and fear can have many sources, Lucy. Sometimes the innocent are more frightened than the guilty, because they cannot understand why such terrible things happen." But privately, Miss Marple acknowledged that Lucy's observations were troubling. Sylvia Fortescue did indeed look guilty. The question was, guilty of murder or guilty of something else entirely? Through the window, she could see Inspector Slack striding across the lawn toward the summer house once more, his notebook in hand. The shadows were lengthening now, the golden afternoon fading into a cooler twilight. The garden party had ended in the worst possible way. And Miss Marple suspected that before this matter was resolved, many more secrets would be dragged into the unforgiving light of day. The evening had drawn its curtain over St. Mary Mead by the time Inspector Slack permitted the remaining guests to depart. Miss Marple walked home slowly through the gathering dusk, her mind turning over the afternoon's events like pages in a well-worn book. The hedgerows released their evening scents, honeysuckle and wild roses, but the pleasant fragrance seemed incongruous against the dark business that occupied her thoughts. Her maid, faithful old Soames, had kept supper warm, but Miss Marple found she had little appetite. Instead, she settled into her favourite chair by the window overlooking the garden, and allowed her thoughts to arrange themselves into some semblance of order. Helena Vane had arrived at the party already carrying her death within her, or so Dr. Haydock's timeline suggested. The poison must have been administered before she entered the vicarage garden, which narrowed the possibilities considerably. Either she had taken it herself, which seemed unlikely given her apparent purpose in visiting St. Mary Mead, or someone had found an opportunity before the party began. The question of motive seemed almost too obvious. Blackmail was an ugly business, and if Lucy's overheard conversation was accurate, Helena Vane had been applying pressure to Sylvia Fortescue. But blackmail over what? And was the secret worth killing for? Miss Marple's reverie was interrupted by a knock at the door. Soames appeared a moment later, looking flustered. "It's Mrs. Fortescue, ma'am. She asks if she might speak with you." "Show her in, Soames." Sylvia Fortescue entered the sitting room like a ghost, her face pale and drawn in the lamplight. She had changed from her garden party dress into something darker and more severe, which only emphasized her haggard appearance. "Miss Marple, forgive me for calling so late." She sank onto the sofa without waiting for an invitation, her composure finally crumbling. "They think I killed her. Inspector Slack hasn't said so directly, but I can see it in his eyes." Miss Marple poured tea from the pot Soames had brought with remarkable speed. "Drink this, my dear. Now tell me everything." Sylvia's hands shook as she accepted the cup. "Helena and I knew each other years ago, before either of us married. We were at school together. Not friends exactly, but we moved in the same circles. She was always the beautiful one, the clever one." "I find that difficult to believe," Miss Marple said gently. "It's true, nonetheless. When we left school, we lost touch. I married Arthur Fortescue and came to live at Gossington Hall. It was a good marriage, quiet and comfortable. Her voice caught. And Mrs. She married that wealthy shipping merchant Vane. Everyone said she'd done very well for herself. Sylvia set down her cup with a clatter. She appeared at Gossington Hall 3 days ago, uninvited and unexpected. At first, I thought it was simply a social call from an old acquaintance. But then she showed me. She stopped, pressing her fingers to her temples. Letters that my husband had written to her years ago. They were... Sylvia's face flushed with shame. They were love letters, Miss Marple. Arthur had been corresponding with her throughout our marriage, meeting her in London when he claimed to be attending to business. Miss Marple's expression remained neutral, though inwardly she felt a pang of sympathy for the woman before her. I see. Worse than that. She said she would take them to the newspapers, that she would expose Arthur's memory as a fraud and a philanderer. Sylvia's voice hardened. She wanted £5,000 to keep silent. Money I don't have. Arthur left debts, you see. The house is mortgaged, and I live on a very modest income. But she wouldn't believe me. Yesterday evening, she'd been staying at the Blue Boar in the village, but I felt obliged to offer her hospitality. We had been at school together, or after all, and I couldn't have people wondering why I'd turned away an old friend. But having her in the house was the torture. Miss Marple considered this carefully. Yet you brought her to the garden party today. She insisted. She said it would look odd if she stayed behind, that people would talk, and she wanted to... Sylvia's voice broke. She wanted to see me suffer in public, I think. To watch me try to maintain appearances while she held that threat over my head. She enjoyed it, Miss Marple. What happened this morning? Sylvia's hands twisted in her lap. We argued again. She gave me until tomorrow to produce the money. When I said I couldn't, she laughed and said she'd begin with Colonel Bantry. She'd tell him some story about the letters, let it spread through the village like wildfire. I was desperate, Miss Marple. My maid, Ethel, was in the next room. Sylvia looked up with haunted eyes. And that's not the worst of it. When Inspector Slack searched Helena's room at my house, he found a flask, silver, with my initials engraved on it. It was Arthur's, something he'd carried for years. Helena must have taken it from the study. Miss Marple's needles had resumed their gentle clicking. Not for months. I assumed it was packed away with Arthur's other things. Sylvia's composure shattered completely. I didn't kill her, Miss Marple. I wanted her gone from my life, yes, but I didn't murder her. The question, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, is not whether I believe you, but whether Inspector Slack does. Sylvia's voice was hollow. They'll arrest me, won't they? Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded her visitor with sharp, intelligent eyes. Tell me, Mrs. Fortescue, did Helena Vane have any other connections in St. Mary Mead? Sylvia frowned, thinking. She mentioned something odd when we arrived at the party. She saw Dr. Haydock and went quite still. Then she said, So he ended up here, did he? No, he avoided her quite deliberately. Sylvia's eyes widened. Miss Marple, you don't think... I think, Miss Marple interrupted gently, that there is a great deal more to this business than appears on the surface. And I think you should go home, get some rest, and say nothing more to Inspector Slack without a solicitor present. Sylvia nodded, gathering herself together. Thank you, Miss Marple. After her visitor had departed, Miss Marple sat in the gathering darkness, her mind working methodically through the tangle of facts and possibilities. Inspector Slack had his obvious suspect, and the evidence against Sylvia Fortescue was certainly compelling. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the obvious answer was often the wrong one. Somewhere in this puzzle lay the truth, and she intended to find it. Miss Marple rose early the following morning, her sleep having been troubled by fragments of conversation and half-formed theories. The dawn broke clear and cool over St. Mary Mead, and she found herself in the garden before Soames had even stirred, dead-heading roses with methodical precision while her mind worked through the problem at hand. The flask bothered her, not its existence, that was perfectly straightforward, but its placement. If Sylvia Fortescue had indeed poisoned Helena Vane, would she have been foolish enough to use an item so clearly traceable to herself? People did foolish things when desperate, certainly, but there was a difference between desperation and idiocy. By 8:30, Miss Marple had made her decision. She would call upon Dr. Haydock. The doctor's house stood at the edge of the village, a comfortable Georgian building with ivy climbing its brick facade. Miss Marple had timed her visit to coincide with the end of morning surgery, and she was shown into the consulting room by Mrs. Moffat, the doctor's housekeeper, who regarded her with undisguised curiosity. Miss Marple. Dr. Haydock looked up from his desk, where he appeared to be writing notes. His face was drawn, and there were shadows beneath his eyes that suggested his night had been no more restful than her own. "I hope I'm not intruding, Doctor." He gestured to a chair. "Of course, though if you're here about Helena Vane's death, I can't tell you much more than what I said yesterday. The police surgeon confirmed my initial assessment. It was indeed poison." Miss Marple settled herself carefully. "Strychnine. How horrible. Extremely painful." He rubbed his face wearily. "I've been thinking about nothing else since yesterday afternoon. If I'd recognized the symptoms sooner, perhaps you mustn't blame yourself, Doctor. From what you said, she had already consumed the poison before arriving at the party." He didn't sound convinced. "Slack is convinced Mrs. Fortescue did it. He came round last night, asking questions about how easily one might obtain strychnine, whether Mrs. Fortescue had ever consulted me about poisons or pest control. I told him the truth, that she'd never asked me anything of the sort, but that doesn't mean she couldn't have acquired it elsewhere." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "You mentioned yesterday that you knew Mrs. Vane, or rather Miss Markham as she was then, many years ago." The doctor's expression hardened. "So you did hear that?" He rose and walked to the window, staring out at the garden. "I was 26, fresh from medical school, full of ambition and idealism. She was a patient, nothing serious, just a fashionable complaint that required fashionable attention." His voice was bitter with old pain. "I was flattered, foolish, and weak. We had an affair." Miss Marple made a sympathetic noise. "Helena told her. When I tried to end the affair, when I realized what I was throwing away, Helena went directly to Catherine and told her everything, with embellishments, naturally." He turned back to face Miss Marple. "The scandal forced me to leave London. I lost my position at the hospital, lost Catherine, lost the future I had planned. I came here to St. Did you ever see Helena Markham again? Once about 5 years ago, I was in London for a medical conference, and I saw her at the theatre with her husband. She looked straight through me. as though I were a stranger. It was clear she'd moved on to bigger game. Vane was enormously wealthy after all. He sat down heavily. When I saw her yesterday in the vicarage garden, my first thought was that she'd come to cause trouble again. No, but she looked at me, just once across the garden, and she smiled. It was a smile I remembered from all those years ago. Triumphant, knowing, cruel. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, her hands folded in her lap. Doctor, I must ask you a difficult question. Haydock's laugh was short and sharp. You think I killed her? I'm simply trying to understand everyone's movements. He sighed. I was making house calls. Old Mrs. Henderson in the morning. She's bedridden with arthritis. Then I stopped at the Mitchell farm. Their youngest had a fever. I arrived at the vicarage around 3:15, perhaps 3:20. Mrs. And you drove directly to Mrs. Not directly, no. I stopped at the dispensary to collect some medications. He met her eyes steadily. I didn't kill Helena Vane, Miss Marple, though I won't pretend I mourned her death when I heard of it. No one has suggested, haven't they? I saw Slack's constable taking notes yesterday when I examined the body. I saw him watching me, and I know how these things work. The police look for motive and opportunity. I had motive in abundance, and as for opportunity, he spread his hands. I'm a doctor. I have access to all manner of poisons, including strychnine. But you also know, Miss Marple said quietly, that strychnine is a terrible way to die. Haydock stared at her, then slowly nodded. You're right. I would have. Despite everything Helena did to me, I wouldn't have wanted her to suffer like that. Strychnine it's vicious. The convulsions, the pain, the consciousness until the very end. No, if I'd done it, I'd have used something cleaner. Then we must ask ourselves, Miss Marple said, who would have chosen such a cruel poison? Someone who wanted Helena Vane not merely dead, but punished. The doctor was silent, contemplating this. Finally, he said, There's something else you should know. When I examined the body, I found bruises on her wrist, recent ones made within the last day or two. Someone had grabbed her, hard enough to leave marks. I mentioned it in my report, yes. He seemed to think it supported his theory about Mrs. Miss Marple rose to leave. Thank you for your candor, Doctor. Miss Marple, he said as she reached the door, if you're thinking of investigating this business, be careful. Whoever killed Helena Vane did so with calculation and malice. I shall be very careful indeed, Miss Marple assured him. I'm simply an elderly lady with an interest in village affairs. But as she walked back through the morning sunshine toward the high street, her mind was far from peaceful. The pieces of the puzzle were accumulating, but they didn't yet form a coherent picture. Sylvia Fortescue had motive and, apparently, means. Dr. Haydock had a powerful motive rooted in the past. And somewhere in this equation was the question of those bruises, the flask, and the choice of poison itself. Miss Marple decided her next call would be to the Blue Boar, where Helena Vane had stayed before moving to Gossington Hall. Innkeepers, in her experience, often knew far more about their guests than anyone suspected. The Blue Boar stood in the centre of St. Mary Mead's High Street, a half-timbered coaching inn that had served travellers for 3 centuries. Its sign, a faded blue boar rampant, creaked gently in the morning breeze as Miss Marple approached. The interior was dim and cool after the brightness outside, smelling pleasantly of beeswax and the bacon that had been served at breakfast. Mr. Albert Biggs, the proprietor, emerged from behind the bar when he heard the door. He was a round man with sharp eyes that missed very little, and he greeted Miss Marple with the deference due to one of the village's most respectable residents. "Miss Marple, this is an honour." "Good morning, Mr. Biggs. I wonder if I might trouble you for a few moments of your time. It's regarding Mrs. Biggs's expression grew sombre. "Terrible business, that. Terrible. The police were here yesterday evening asking all manner of questions. Inspector Slack went through her room himself, took away some papers and such. The lady had already settled her bill and moved to Gossington Hall, but she'd left a trunk here. Said she'd collect it when she departed St. 5 days in total before she moved to Mrs. Fortescue's." He lowered his voice, though there was no one else in the public room. "Kept herself to herself mostly. Took her meals in her room, didn't socialize with the other guests." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Telephone calls?" "From the kiosk in the village, actually. I happened to notice her using it several times. The kiosk is just across the street, you see, visible from the bar windows. Seemed odd, her walking all the way there when she could have used our telephone." Biggs considered. Thursday evening quite late, must have been near 9 o'clock. Then again Friday morning and Saturday afternoon. Each time she was in there for at least 10 minutes, sometimes longer. "Saturday afternoon," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "That would have been the day before the garden party. The day before Helena Vane moved to Gossington Hall. Not that I saw, but—" He hesitated, then continued. "My wife mentioned something peculiar. Thursday evening, after Mrs. Vane had gone up to her room, a gentleman came asking after her. Well-dressed fellow, London type by the look of him. He didn't give a name, just asked if a Mrs. That we couldn't give out information about our guests naturally. Hotel policy. But he was insistent, said it was a matter of some urgency. In the end, my wife told him that if he wanted to leave a message, she'd see it was delivered. He thought about it for a moment, then said no, he'd call back." Biggs frowned in concentration. "Middle-aged, my wife said. Well-built, going a bit grey at the temples. Expensive overcoat, carried a walking stick with a silver handle. Spoke educated-like, but there was something hard about him, if you take my meaning." Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. "And Mrs. More angry than frightened, I'd say. Especially after those telephone calls. She had a temper on her, that one. Heard her shouting in her room one evening. Couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear enough. Some of it. He was more interested in whether we kept rat poison on the premises. Which we do, of course, in the cellars and outbuildings. But it's kept locked away. And I told him so." Miss Marple thanked him and was turning to leave when Biggs added, "There was one other thing, Miss Marple. Might be nothing, but since you're asking, on Friday morning I saw Mrs. Vane walking past the church with another lady. They were arguing, or at least having what looked like a heated discussion. I didn't think much of it at the time, but when I heard later that she'd been staying at Gossington Hall, I realized the other woman must have been Mrs. You're certain it was Mrs. Certain enough. I've seen her in the village. Often enough over the years. They were standing near the lich gate, and Mrs. Vane had her hand on Mrs. Fortescue's arm, gripping it tight-like. Mrs. Fortescue looked like she wanted to pull away, but couldn't. The bruises, Miss Marple thought. Those bruises Dr. Haydock had found. Miss Marple emerged from the Blue Boar into the sunshine, her mind working rapidly. The mysterious gentleman from London, the telephone calls, the argument with Sylvia Fortescue. Each piece of information opened new questions rather than answering old ones. She decided to walk past the church on her way home, taking the path that led by the lich gate, where Helena Vane and Sylvia Fortescue had been seen arguing. It was a quiet spot, shaded by ancient yews, the kind of place where one might have a private conversation without fear of being overheard. As she stood there considering the implications of what she'd learned, a voice spoke behind her. "Miss Marple?" She turned to find Colonel Bantry approaching, his bulldog Brutus waddling beside him on a lead. "Good morning, Colonel." "Indeed, indeed." The Colonel mopped his brow with a handkerchief. "Dreadful business about Mrs. Vane? My wife's been in a state about it." "Slack's convinced it was Mrs. Fortescue, you know. Came round yesterday evening asking whether Dolly or I had noticed anything suspicious. I told him straight. Mrs. Fortescue's no more a murderer than I am. Known her for years. You knew Mr. reasonably well. We'd have dinner occasionally, play cards. Decent chap, if a bit distracted at times. Always seemed to have business in London, more than you'd expect for a gentleman of leisure." The Colonel paused, his expression thoughtful. "You know, there was something odd. About 6 months before Arthur died, he came to me wanting to borrow a substantial sum of money. Wouldn't say what it was for, just that he was in a bit of a tight spot and needed help. I lent it to him, £500, which he paid back within 2 months. Didn't think of it until this morning." "One never knows what might be relevant," Miss Marple said carefully. "Did Mr. Now that you mention it, yes. The last time I saw him must have been a week before his heart attack. He looked positively haggard. Said he hadn't been sleeping well. I suggested he see Dr. The Colonel shook his head. Wish I'd pressed him on it now. They parted ways, and Miss Marple continued her walk home, her mind churning with possibilities. Arthur Fortescue had been keeping secrets, borrowing money, making frequent trips to London. Helena Vane had claimed to possess love letters from him. Could those letters have been genuine? Or was there something else, something more sinister, that connected Arthur Fortescue to Helena Vane? And if Arthur had been involved in something shameful or criminal, might that not provide an even stronger motive for murder than simple blackmail over a love affair? The pieces were beginning to shift, forming new patterns. Miss Marple had the distinct feeling that she was missing something crucial, some central truth around which all the other facts revolved. She needed to speak with Sylvia Fortescue again, and this time she needed the complete truth. Gossington Hall stood at the end of a long gravel drive, its Elizabethan facade softened by climbing wisteria that had bloomed weeks earlier. Miss Marple arrived just before noon, having sent no word of her coming. She believed that unannounced visits often yielded more truthful responses than carefully scheduled appointments. The door was answered by a thin, nervous-looking woman in her 40s, whom Miss Marple recognized as Ethel, the Fortescue's maid. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she twisted her apron anxiously between her fingers. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Fortescue isn't receiving visitors today. I understand, Ethel, but I believe Mrs. Fortescue will want to see me." The maid hesitated, then nodded and disappeared into the house's dim interior. Miss Marple waited in the entrance hall, noting the faded grandeur around her, the portrait of some long-dead Fortescue ancestor whose frame needed regilding, the Persian carpet worn thin in places, the vase of garden roses that couldn't quite disguise the general air of genteel poverty. Sylvia Fortescue appeared at the top of the stairs, descending slowly. She wore black, though whether in mourning for Helena Vane or simply because it suited her mood was unclear. Her face was drawn and pale, making her appear 10 years older than she had at the garden party just 2 days before. "Miss Marple." Her voice was flat, exhausted. The morning room faced south, filled with light that seemed almost cruel in its brightness. Sylvia gestured Miss Marple to a chair and sank into another, her movements those of a woman who had given up fighting. "Inspector Slack was here again this morning," she said without preamble. "He's building his case against me. The flask, the arguments, the motive, it all points to me, doesn't it?" "Mrs. Fortescue," Miss Marple said gently, "I believe you when you say you didn't kill Helena Vane, but I cannot help you unless you tell me the complete truth. No more half-truths, no more protecting anyone's reputation." Sylvia's laugh was bitter. "The truth. Very well, Miss Marple." Miss Marple waited, her hands folded quietly in her lap. Arthur wasn't having an affair with Helena, not in the conventional sense at any rate. The letters she showed me weren't love letters. They were— Sylvia's voice broke. "They were blackmail payments." The words came out in a rush, as if Sylvia had been holding them back for too long. Arthur was married before Miss Marple, to a woman named Catherine Mills in London 28 years ago. They separated after only 6 months, but there was never a divorce. When he married me 15 years later, he was still legally married to Catherine. Our marriage was bigamous. Miss Marple absorbed this shocking revelation calmly. She'd known Catherine Mills. They'd been friends in their youth. When Catherine died 5 years ago, Helena somehow acquired papers proving the first marriage. She approached Arthur, threatened to expose him. The scandal would have destroyed us, destroyed his position in the village, potentially led to criminal charges, so he paid her. The trips to London, the borrowed money, all for Helena. She was insatiable, always demanding more. It's what killed him, I'm certain of it. The stress, the fear of discovery, the constant drain on our finances. Sylvia's eyes filled with tears. And when he died, I thought it was over. I thought I was free. But then Helena arrived here claiming that the obligation passed to me. She said that if I didn't pay, she'd expose Arthur's bigamy posthumously, and I'd lose everything. The house, my place in society, my very identity as Mrs. Why didn't you simply tell the truth? You don't understand, Sylvia said desperately. The house belongs to Arthur's nephew, technically. I have the right to live here only as Arthur's widow. If it were proven that I was never legally married to him, I'd be turned out without a penny. Hoping to find some way to pay her off, or to find evidence I could use against her in return. Arthur kept files, records of the payments. Sylvia's hands clenched. But she was clever. She'd destroyed any evidence that might incriminate her. The argument outside the vicarage, when you said, "This is blackmail," she'd increased her demands again. She wanted £10,000 immediately, or she'd go to the newspapers that very week. Sylvia met Miss Marple's eyes. So you see, I had every reason to want her dead. Miss Marple considered this carefully. Sylvia flushed. Yes, on Friday, when she first told me about the increased demand, I was so angry, so desperate, I seized her arm. She laughed at me, told me I was pathetic. And the flask, the one found with poison in it. I've thought and thought about that. It was in Arthur's study, in a drawer of his desk. I saw it there weeks ago when I was sorting through his papers. Helena must have taken it when she was exploring the house. She was always poking about, opening drawers, examining things. Did anyone else know about Arthur's first marriage? Sylvia shook her head slowly. I don't see how they could have. Arthur was terrified of anyone finding out. He'd kept it secret for nearly 30 years. She stopped abruptly. Wait, Doctor... Arthur consulted him about his heart condition. But more than that, one evening, about a year before Arthur died, he came home very shaken. He'd seen Dr. Haydock in London quite by chance, having lunch with a woman. Arthur thought the woman looked familiar, but he couldn't place her. Later, he realized it might have been Catherine Mills. He'd only seen her a few times before her death, but there was something about her that triggered his memory. Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly. Dr. Haydock had been engaged to Catherine Mills before Helena Markham destroyed that engagement. If Arthur Fortescue had married Catherine first, and if Haydock had remained in contact with her over the years, then the doctor might well have known about Arthur's bigamy. Did Arthur ever speak to No, he was too afraid of confirming his suspicions. Mrs. Fortescue, Miss Marple said slowly, I need you to think very carefully. On the day of the garden party, before you and Mrs. Sylvia frowned. We had coffee in the drawing room around 1 o'clock. Ethel brought it in on a tray, 2 cups, milk and sugar. Helena took hers black, as she always did. Ethel would have done, in the kitchen. But Miss Marple, you can't think Ethel wouldn't. I'm not suggesting anything, Miss Marple said gently. I'm simply trying to establish the facts. Did Mrs. Yes, actually. She went upstairs to fetch her hat and gloves. She was gone perhaps 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Long enough for someone to add strychnine to an unattended coffee cup. But who? Ethel the maid was the obvious suspect. But what possible motive could she have? Unless, Mrs. Fortescue, did Ethel overhear your arguments with Helena Vane? Did she know what Mrs. Sylvia's face went white. Oh God, yes, she must have heard everything. These old walls are thin, and Ethel was always about the house, cleaning, dusting. And she's devoted to me, Miss Marple. Absolutely devoted. Devoted enough to commit murder? Miss Marple wondered. It was certainly possible. But there were still too many unanswered questions, too many pieces that didn't quite fit. I must go, Miss Marple said, rising. But Mrs. Fortescue, I urge you again, say nothing more to Inspector Slack without your solicitor present, and keep Ethel close. As Miss Marple walked back down the gravel drive, she knew she was close to understanding. But the final piece of the puzzle still eluded her. Miss Marple did not go directly home from Gossington Hall. Instead, she made her way to the vicarage, where she found Mrs. Clement in the kitchen supervising the preparation of jam for the church bazaar. The good woman looked up with evident relief when Miss Marple appeared. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank goodness! I've been simply desperate to talk to someone sensible about all this dreadful business." Mrs. Clement wiped her hands on her apron. "Would you like some tea?" They settled in the morning room, away from the bustle of the kitchen. Mrs. Clement poured tea with hands that trembled slightly, betraying her agitation. "I can't stop thinking about it," she confessed. "That poor woman, dying right there in our summer house, while we were all just across the lawn, chatting and eating sandwiches, and to think the poison was already inside her, that she walked into our garden carrying her own death." "Mrs. Clement," Miss Marple said gently, "I wonder if you could help me with something. On the day of the party, did you notice anything unusual?" The vicar's wife considered this carefully. "Well, there was rather a lot of coming and going, as there always is at these affairs. People wandering about the garden, admiring the roses, using the facilities." She paused. "Though now that you mention it, I did think it odd that Ethel, Miss Marple's attention sharpened. Not as a guest, of course. She arrived perhaps 20 minutes after Mrs. Fortescue and Mrs. Vane came round to the kitchen door with a basket, said that Mrs. Fortescue had forgotten her handkerchiefs and asked her to bring them. It seemed a bit excessive. Surely Only a few minutes. She handed over the basket and left, or at least I thought she left. But later, this is probably nothing, I saw someone who looked rather like her near the side gate, the one that leads to the lane. It must have been around 3 o'clock, perhaps a bit after, just before Miss Marple felt the pieces beginning to align themselves. Ethel had been at the vicarage during the critical period. She had access to the grounds, had been seen near the side gate, the gate that was only a short distance from the summer house, screened from the main party by lilac bushes. I don't think I did. It didn't seem significant at the time, and with everything else happening, she looked worried. "Perhaps you should speak with him soon," Miss Marple said diplomatically. "Now, there's one more thing I need to ask. Yes, we always use the same china for garden parties." "Certainly." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. That eliminated one possibility she had been considering. Whatever had been done to Helena Vane's coffee must have been done at Gossington Hall, not at the vicarage. She finished her tea and took her leave, but instead of heading home, she turned her steps back toward Gossington Hall. The afternoon was growing warm, and by the time she reached the house, she was grateful for the shade of the ancient oaks that lined the drive. This time, she didn't go to the front door. Instead, she made her way round to the servants' entrance at the back, where she found Ethel in the kitchen garden, hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 apple trees. The maid started violently when she saw Miss Marple, and a pillowcase slipped from her hands into the grass. "Miss Marple." "Forgive me, Ethel. I didn't mean to startle you." Ethel's eyes darted toward the house, then back to Miss Marple. I don't know that I should, I've just come from speaking with Mrs. Fortescue," Miss Marple said gently. "I think you know that she's in terrible trouble. The police believe she murdered Mrs. The words burst from Ethel with passionate force. "Mrs. Fortescue wouldn't hurt anyone. She's the kindest, most generous lady I've ever known." Then help me prove her innocence." Ethel's face crumpled, and she sank onto a wooden bench beside the garden wall. Miss Marple sat down next to her, waiting with patient silence. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Ethel whispered finally. "I was only trying to protect her. Mrs. Fortescue, I mean. She's been so good to me all these years, gave me a position when no one else would, treated me like family. I heard them arguing. I couldn't help it. I was in the linen closet upstairs, and they were in the drawing room below. Mrs. Vane was saying such cruel things, laughing at Mrs. Fortescue's distress. She said she'd destroy everything, expose all the secrets, leave Mrs. Ethel's hands twisted in her apron. I knew about Mr. Fortescue's first marriage. I'd known for years. I found the marriage certificate once when I was cleaning his study, hidden in a locked drawer that wasn't quite shut. I never told anyone, never even told Mr. Fortescue I knew." Ethel's head snapped up. "How did you—" She stopped, her face going pale. "You know, don't you?" "I believe I have," Miss Marple said quietly. "But I need to hear it from you, Ethel." The maid's resistance collapsed entirely. "I put the strychnine in her coffee. We keep it in the garden shed for the rats, have done for years. I knew where the key was kept. That morning, while Mrs. Fortescue was getting dressed and Mrs. Vane was still in her room, I went to the shed and took some. And when Mrs. Vane went upstairs to fetch her hat, I slipped it into her cup. It dissolved almost instantly in the hot coffee. I thought—" Ethel's voice broke. "I thought she'd drink it and feel ill. Maybe have to leave St. Mary Mead. Go back to London. I didn't know it would kill her so quickly. I didn't even know if it would work at all. I'm not educated, Miss Marple. I don't know about poisons and dosages. I just wanted her to suffer a bit, the way she'd made Mrs. Miss Marple felt a wave of pity for this simple woman who had committed murder out of misguided loyalty. I was frightened. I thought maybe I should warn Mrs. Vane, tell her not to drink anything else, but I was too much of a coward. So I brought those handkerchiefs. There was no need for them really, but I wanted to see what was happening. And I saw her, walking around the garden, talking and smiling like she hadn't a care in the world. I hated her in that moment, Miss Marple. No, I swear I didn't. I just watched from the lane, through the gate, and then she went into the summer house, and I thought perhaps the poison hadn't worked after all. Tears were streaming down Ethel's face now. But it had worked, hadn't it? I killed her. And now, Miss Marple sat in silence for a moment, her mind working through the implications. Ethel's confession explained much, but not everything. There was still something that didn't fit, some element of the puzzle that remained stubbornly out of place. "Ethel," she said slowly, "the flask that was found with poison in it, Arthur Fortescue's flask. Do you know how it came to be in Mrs. Ethel looked confused. "Flask? I don't know anything about a flask. I put the poison in her coffee, that's all." And in that moment, Miss Marple understood. The flask was a red herring. Or rather, it was evidence of a second poisoning attempt. One that had failed because Ethel's had succeeded first. Someone else had also tried to kill Helena Vane. Miss Marple left Ethel sitting in the garden, her confession hanging in the air like the scent of the roses surrounding them. She had urged the maid to remain at Gossington Hall, and to say nothing until Miss Marple had time to think through all the implications. The poor woman had agreed, too devastated by her own admission to do anything but nod mutely. As Miss Marple walked back through the village, her mind was consumed with the problem of the flask. Inspector Slack had found it in Helena Vane's room, with traces of poison inside. Ethel swore she knew nothing about it, and Miss Marple believed her. The maid's confession had been too raw, too unrehearsed to be anything but truth. She had poisoned the coffee, nothing more. Which meant someone else had attempted murder as well. The flask had been Arthur Fortescue's, taken from his study at Gossington Hall. Helena Vane must have stolen it during her stay there. But why? A silver flask would have some value, certainly, but Helena Vane had not been reduced to petty theft, unless she had taken it for another reason entirely. Miss Marple's steps slowed as a thought occurred to her. What if Helena had taken the flask not to keep it, but to use it? What if she had intended to implicate someone in her own murder? It seemed fantastical, yet it aligned with what Miss Marple knew of the woman's character. Helena Vane had been cruel, calculating and theatrical. Might she not have staged her own poisoning attempt, ensuring the evidence pointed to Sylvia Fortescue, thereby guaranteeing continued blackmail payments? But the plan had gone awry because Ethel had poisoned her first, with a dose that actually killed her. Miss Marple arrived home to find a message from Dr. Haydock requesting she call on him at her earliest convenience. She went immediately, sensing urgency in the summons. The doctor admitted her himself, his face grave. "Thank you for coming so quickly." He led her into his study and closed the door firmly. "The autopsy results are final. Helena Vane died from strychnine poisoning, as I suspected." Miss Marple sat down heavily. It did. The arsenic was present in smaller quantities, consistent with doses administered over several days, possibly a week or more. Dr. Haydock ran his hand through his hair, making it stand on end. "Someone had been trying to kill her for some time, Miss Marple." "Or vice versa," Miss Marple murmured. "It would appear so. I've informed Inspector Slack, of course. He's quite thrown by it all. His simple case against Miss Marple thought of Ethel's confession. The maid had used strychnine from the garden shed in a single desperate act. But arsenic over several days suggested premeditation, planning, patient malice. That was a different sort of murder entirely. "The flask that was found," she said slowly. Haydock studied her intently. "I have several, Doctor, none of them complete. More difficult than strychnine, which is readily available as rat poison. Arsenic was once common in weed killers and insecticides, but it's been restricted in recent years. A doctor might have access to it for medical purposes. It was used historically for certain treatments." Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. "That's possible. Many households kept arsenical compounds before the restrictions." Miss Marple rose to leave, her mind already racing ahead. "Thank you, Doctor." "Miss Marple, be careful. We're dealing with someone who has been patient and methodical." The afternoon was fading into evening as Miss Marple made her way to the Gossington Hall once more. This time she went directly to the garden shed that Ethel had mentioned. It was an old stone building, half hidden behind a tangle of rhododendrons, with a heavy wooden door secured by a rusted padlock. The lock yielded easily to a hairpin. Miss Marple had learned this useful skill from her nephew Raymond's detective novels, and she slipped inside. The interior was dim and musty, shelves lined with terracotta pots, gardening tools, and various bottles and tins accumulated over decades. She found the strychnine easily enough, labelled clearly as rat poison. But she searched more carefully, moving aside old paint tins and seed packets until her fingers closed on a small brown bottle pushed to the back of the highest shelf. The bottle was half empty. Miss Marple held it carefully, examining it in the dim light filtering through the grimy window. Someone had been using this, taking small amounts over a period of time. But who had access to this shed besides Ethel? The household staff, certainly. Sylvia Fortescue herself, as mistress of the house. But also, potentially, anyone who had visited Gossington Hall in recent weeks. Helena Vane had been staying there for 2 days before the garden party. Had she discovered this bottle? Had she been poisoning herself with arsenic, building up evidence for a false accusation of attempted murder? It seemed mad, but Miss Marple had learned that people driven by greed or malice were capable of extraordinary things. She was replacing the bottle when she heard footsteps on the gravel path outside. Quickly, she slipped behind a stack of empty flower pots just as the door swung open. Sylvia Fortescue entered the shed, moving with purpose toward the shelf where the poisons were kept. She was reaching for something when she froze, her hand suspended in mid-air. "I know you're there," she said quietly. "I saw you come in from the house." Miss Marple emerged from her hiding place, brushing dust from her skirt. "Mrs. Fortescue?" It wasn't a question. Sylvia's face was composed, almost resigned. "No, but I knew it was here. Arthur used it years ago to kill weeds along the drive. When I was searching for ways to protect myself from Helena, I remembered it. I thought," she laughed bitterly, "I thought if I could just make her ill enough to leave St. Mary Mead, I'd be safe. But I never had the courage to actually do it. Every time I came out here, I'd stand exactly where I'm standing now, reach for that bottle and then stop. I couldn't do it, Miss Marple. But someone did use it. The police surgeon found arsenic in Mrs. Sylvia's eyes widened in shock. Then it wasn't just the strychnine? It would appear so. "Ethel," Sylvia breathed. "Dear God, has Ethel been—" "No," Miss Marple said firmly. "Ethel used strychnine. Once in the coffee that morning. She's already confessed as much to me." "But who?" Miss Marple looked at the bottle of poison, at Sylvia Fortescue's stricken face, and at the gathering shadows outside the shed. The answer was there, just beyond her grasp, waiting for one final piece of information to bring it into focus. "Mrs. Fortescue," she said slowly, "those telephone calls Helena made from the village kiosk. You said she mentioned Dr. Haydock when you arrived at the garden party. Did she mention anyone else?" Sylvia thought hard. She said something odd that first evening at dinner. She was looking through the local newspaper and laughed suddenly. She said, "How amusing that they're all still here, like insects preserved in amber." Old friends. People from Helena's past who had cause to fear or hate her. And suddenly, Miss Marple knew exactly where to look next. Miss Marple left Gossington Hall with her mind working furiously. Old friends who hoped never to see Helena Vane again. The phrase echoed with significance. Dr. Haydock was one such person, certainly, but his connection to Helena was already known. There had to be others, perhaps people whose grievances against her went deeper than anyone suspected. The evening was settling over St. Mary Mead with that particular quality of summer twilight that makes everything seem slightly unreal. Miss Marple walked slowly, allowing her thoughts to arrange themselves. Someone had been administering arsenic to Helena Vane over a period of days. That meant someone who had regular access to her food or drink, either at the Blue Boar or at Gossington Hall. A sudden thought struck her, and she altered her course toward the village post office, which stayed open late on Wednesdays for the convenience of those collecting parcels. Mrs. Jameson, the postmistress, was a fount of information about the comings and goings in St. Mary Mead, though she would have been mortally offended to be called a gossip. "Miss Marple!" Mrs. Jameson was a sharp-featured woman with eyes that missed nothing. "I was wondering about those telephone calls Mrs. Vane made from the kiosk last week." Mrs. Jameson's expression grew knowing. "I can indeed. Saw her in there several times as it happens. Lavinia Harmon, it was. Nearly knocked the poor dear's shopping basket right out of her hands. Miss Lavinia said something sharp about people watching where they were going, but Mrs. The Harmon sisters again. Miss Marple felt a small stirring of interest. The sisters had been remarkably well informed about Helena Vane's past, about the death of her husband and the rumours surrounding it. "Mrs. Jameson, how long have the Harmon sisters lived in St. Must be 15 years now, perhaps a bit more. They came from London, I believe. Took the cottage on the edge of the village. Primrose Cottage, they call it, though there's not a primrose to be seen. 15 years. That would place their arrival around the time of Mr. Vane's death." Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Jameson and made her way through the gathering dusk to Primrose Cottage. The cottage was a small, neat building with a well-tended garden, though neat was perhaps too generous a word. Every surface seemed crowded with ornaments, every wall covered with pictures and embroidered mottos. The Harmon sisters answered the door together, as they seemed to do everything together, their faces registering surprise at the late visit. "Miss Marple, what a surprise!" Lavinia ushered her into a sitting room so cluttered with furniture and knickknacks that it was difficult to find a place to sit. "I hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple said, settling carefully onto a horsehair sofa. "I wanted to ask you about Mrs. Vane." The sisters exchanged glances. Harriet spoke first. "Well, we did know her, years ago, in London." Another exchanged glance, this one laden with meaning. Lavinia sighed. "We worked for her husband, actually, Mr. Vane, in his household as companions to his elderly mother. We were there for 3 years," Harriet added. "Mrs. Vane Sr. was a dear woman, very kind to us. And then Mr. Lavinia's voice hardened. "Everything changed after that. Helena had no time for her mother-in-law. found her tiresome and inconvenient. She wanted the old lady put away in a home, but Mr. Vane wouldn't hear of it. So Helena made all our lives miserable instead. She reduced our wages, dismissed most of the household staff, made the house so uncomfortable that poor Mrs. She died within 6 months of Helena's arrival, Harriet said bitterly. Broken-hearted, in our opinion. And then Helena dismissed us without references, claiming we'd been stealing from the household. Miss Marple's sympathies were engaged, but her mind was also racing. We nearly starved, Lavinia said flatly. Without references, we couldn't find positions. We had to take in sewing, live in one squalid room after another. It took us years to save enough to leave London and start fresh here in Saint-Ouen. And you recognized Mrs. Not immediately, Harriet admitted. She'd aged, of course, and she was calling herself Vane rather than using her first name. But when we heard her voice, we knew. That particular laugh of hers, cruel and mocking. Both sisters spoke at once, with surprising vehemence. Then Lavinia continued more quietly. We avoided her entirely. We didn't want her to recognize us, to perhaps spread lies about us here as she'd done in London. This is our home now, Miss Marple. We've built a life here. Miss Marple studied them carefully. 2 elderly women living quietly, nursing a 15-year-old grievance. It seemed far-fetched to imagine either of them as a murderess, yet she had learned that even the most unlikely people were capable of violence when sufficiently provoked. She asked gently. The sisters looked at each other again. This time, it was Harriet who answered. We saw her in the village the day after she arrived. She was coming out of the chemist's shop. We ducked into the bakery before she could see us, but our hearts were racing. The chemist's shop, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. No idea, Lavinia said. We didn't dare ask. Miss Marple made a mental note to visit Mr. Edwards first thing in the morning. Just one more question, if you don't mind. Gossington Hall? Harriet looked genuinely puzzled. Why would we? We barely know Mrs. Lavinia's eyes narrowed slightly. I'm simply trying to understand everyone's movements, Miss Marple said soothingly. We arrived at the vicarage together and left together, Harriet said firmly. We were never out of each other's sight. We stayed near the refreshment table for most of the party, away from Mrs. Miss Marple thanked them and took her leave, walking home through streets now fully dark. The Harmon sisters had motive, a 15-year-old grudge and fear of exposure. But they'd had no access to Helena Vane at Gossington Hall, and they claimed to have been together throughout the garden party, unless one of them was lying to protect the other. As Miss Marple let herself into her own house, she reflected that this case was like one of those Russian nesting dolls. Each answer revealed another question hidden inside it. But she was getting closer to the truth. She could feel it, the way one feels rain approaching on a summer afternoon. Tomorrow she would visit the chemist's shop and find out exactly what Helena Vane had purchased. And then, perhaps, the final pieces would fall into place. In her sitting room, she settled into her chair with her knitting, but her needles remained still in her lap. Her mind was too active for the soothing rhythm of stitches. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead was a patient, methodical killer who had fed Helena Vane arsenic over the course of days, waiting for death to come slowly. And Miss Marple intended to unmask them before they could claim another victim. Miss Marple was at the chemist's shop when it opened the following morning. Mr. Edwards, a precise man in his 50s with spectacles that perpetually slid down his nose, greeted her with professional courtesy. "Miss Marple?" "Quite well, thank you, Mr. Edwards. Actually, I was hoping you might help me with a rather delicate matter. It concerns Mrs. Edwards' expression grew guarded. "I've already spoken with Inspector Slack about Mrs. Vane. I understand she visited your shop the day after she arrived in St. Mary Mead." The chemist hesitated, clearly torn between professional discretion and natural curiosity. Curiosity won. "She bought several items, actually. Headache powders, stomach tablets, and—" He paused. "She asked specifically for a tonic containing arsenic. Said she'd been taking it for years on her doctor's advice, for her complexion." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "I did not. I explained that such preparations are no longer sold without a prescription, and even then, they're rarely prescribed nowadays. She became quite angry, said I was being difficult, that any proper chemist would accommodate a lady's request. I held firm, of course." "Did she ask about anything else?" Edwards pushed his spectacles up his nose, thinking. "She did inquire about purchasing laudanum, claiming she had trouble sleeping. Again, I explained that I couldn't dispense it without a prescription. Miss Marple absorbed this information. Helena Vane had been seeking arsenic for herself, ostensibly for her complexion, but more likely to stage her own poisoning and implicate Sylvia Fortescue. When that failed, she must have found another source." "Mr. Edwards, during the days before the garden party, did anyone else make any unusual purchases?" The chemist's eyes widened slightly behind his spectacles. "You're asking if someone bought poison? Miss Marple, I can't possibly—" "I'm asking," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "if you noticed anything out of the ordinary." Edward sighed. "There was one thing, though, I didn't think much of it at the time. Dr. Haydock came in on the Friday before the garden party, the day Mrs. Vane moved to Gossington Hall. He purchased a bottle of brandy, which wasn't unusual in itself. Doctors sometimes prescribe it for patients with weak hearts or as a general tonic. But when I asked if it was for a patient, he seemed oddly evasive. Yes, immediately. He seemed in rather a hurry, actually." Miss Marple thanked the chemist and stepped back out into the morning sunshine, her mind working rapidly. Dr. Haydock buying brandy the same day Helena Vane moved to Gossington Hall. The flask found with poison in it had belonged to Arthur Fortescue and likely contained spirits, brandy or whiskey. Could Dr. Haydock have poisoned the flask and somehow arranged for Helena to find it and drink from it? But that made no sense. Why would she drink from a flask she'd stolen herself, especially if it was meant to be planted evidence? Unless the doctor had somehow known she would take the flask, had deliberately left it where she would find it, already poisoned. Miss Marple's next destination was inevitable. She found Dr. Haydock at his surgery, looking haggard and anxious. He admitted her without his usual cheerful greeting. "I was expecting you," he said quietly, gesturing her to a chair. "Or rather, I was expecting someone. The police, most likely. I have." Haydock sank into his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. "I didn't kill her, Miss Marple. You must believe that. But I tried to. Helena telephoned me on the Thursday evening. I don't know how she got my number. Probably from the local directory. She said she knew I was in St. For the affair we'd had all those years ago. She said she'd kept letters I'd written to her. Foolish, passionate letters that would destroy my reputation if they became public. She wanted money, of course." His laugh was bitter. "I told her I needed time to gather the money. She said she'd give me until Saturday, the day of the garden party. I was desperate, Miss Marple. I've built a good life here, earned the trust of my patients. The thought of all that being destroyed by letters written in a moment of youthful folly." He stopped, struggling for composure. "I purchased it and laced it with arsenic. I had some in my dispensary, old stock from years ago, kept for experimental purposes." Miss Marple sat forward. "You stole the flask?" "I'd been treating Arthur for his heart condition, making house calls to Gossington Hall. I knew about his collection of personal items in the study. I took the flask on one of my visits months ago, thinking—" He laughed bitterly. "I don't know what I was thinking. That I might use it someday, I suppose. I tried to. On Friday morning I went to Gossington Hall under the pretense of checking on Mrs. Fortescue's health. She'd mentioned feeling unwell at a church function. While I was there, I asked to use the bathroom. A peace offering from an old friend." He looked up at Miss Marple with haunted eyes. "But she never drank from it. When she died at the garden party, I thought perhaps she had, that my poison had worked. But then the police surgeon found strychnine, not arsenic." "The flask was found with poison in it," Miss Marple pointed out. "Exactly. Which means my murderous attempt failed completely. She saw through my little gift, suspected it was poisoned, and kept it as evidence." Miss Marple considered this carefully. It explained the flask, explained Dr. Haydock's evasiveness. But it still left the question of the arsenic found in Helena's system during the autopsy. "Doctor, you said you used arsenic from your dispensary. Enough to be fatal. Perhaps 2 or 3 grains. Haydock frowned. "That's impossible. I only poisoned the flask that once, on Friday morning, taking it herself. But why would—" The doctor stopped abruptly. "Fowler's solution. And when he refused, she must have found another source." Haydock nodded slowly. "It's not only possible, it's quite probable. Arsenic, in small doses over time, produces distinctive symptoms: nausea, stomach pains, weakness." Miss Marple rose to her feet, her mind suddenly clear. "Doctor, I must go, but I strongly suggest you speak with Inspector Slack immediately and tell him everything you've told me." As she left the surgery, Miss Marple knew she was finally approaching the truth. Helena Vane had been poisoning herself with arsenic, creating evidence for her blackmail plots. Someone, Ethel, had then poisoned her with strychnine, actually killing her. And Dr. Haydock had attempted to poison her as well, though his attempt had failed. 3 different poisoning attempts, 3 different perpetrators, all targeting the same victim. But there was still one piece missing, and Miss Marple intended to find it. Miss Marple walked slowly through the village, her mind arranging and rearranging the facts like pieces on a chessboard. The morning had grown warm, and she sought shade beneath the lime trees that lined the path to the vicarage. She needed to speak with Lucy Clement once more, to verify a detail that had been nagging at her consciousness. She found the vicar's daughter in the garden, half-heartedly deadheading roses. The girl's face brightened when she saw Miss Marple, though shadows of distress still lingered in her eyes. "Miss Marple, have you heard? They've arrested Ethel, Mrs. Fortescue's maid. Inspector Slack came this morning and took her away. Everyone's saying she confessed to poisoning Mrs. Yes, I know about Ethel's confession," Miss Marple said gently. "Lucy, I need you to think very carefully about something. When you took the headache powders to Mrs. Vane in the summer house, you said you found her already dead." Lucy's face paled at the memory, but she concentrated. She was lying on the chaise longue. Her face was It was horrible, Miss Marple. Twisted, like she'd been in terrible pain. Her hands were clenched and there was... She stopped, swallowing hard. There was a teacup on the table beside her. It had fallen over, and there was liquid spilled on the table and the floor. Lucy shook her head. No, that's what was odd. It was a different cup entirely. Fine china with pink rosebuds. Miss Marple felt a small thrill of certainty. I didn't look closely. The inspector went through it later. Thank you, Lucy. Miss Marple's next stop was the police station, where she found Inspector Slack in his office, surrounded by papers and looking thoroughly frustrated. Miss Marple, he said without enthusiasm. Not at all, Inspector. Ethel did poison Mrs. Vane. That much is true. Slack gestured wearily to a chair. Go on, then. Helena Vane brought her own teacup to the summer house. That suggests she was planning to drink something specific. Something she'd brought with her. The inspector consulted his notes. There was a small silver flask in her handbag. It contained brandy laced with arsenic. We've established it belonged to Arthur Fortescue. We assumed Mrs. I believe Dr. Haydock can enlighten you about that flask, Miss Marple said carefully. Letters, a compact, some money, and a small brown bottle. The bottle was labelled as a patent medicine. Dr. Bennett's restorative tonic. We had it analysed. Correspondence from various people. Some from Arthur Fortescue, some from other individuals. Slack's expression darkened. We found a ledger in her room at Gossington Hall, listing payments received and amounts still owed. Miss Marple nodded. This confirmed her theory. Inspector, I believe Helena Vane had been taking that arsenical tonic herself, in small doses, to produce symptoms of poisoning. She intended to claim that someone was trying to kill her, probably Mrs. Slack looked skeptical. Perhaps, but it's also cunning. The symptoms would be real, documented by doctors if necessary. She could point to whoever she wished to frame and produce the poisoned flask as evidence. Precisely. Ethel put strychnine in her coffee that morning at Gossington Hall. Mrs. Vane drank it without suspecting, then went to the garden party. When she began to feel unwell, more severely than she'd expected, she retired to the summer house. I believe she thought her self-administered arsenic was simply taking stronger effect than usual. No, it was the strychnine, and by the time she realized something was desperately wrong, it was too late. Miss Marple's voice was somber. Slack was silent for a moment, absorbing this. So, Ethel killed her, but Mrs. Vane was already poisoning herself, and Dr. It's rather unprecedented, I admit. Miss Marple paused. There is one other matter, Inspector. The Harmon sisters, those two gossiping old biddies. They knew Helena Vane in London years ago. She destroyed their livelihoods and reputations. They recognized her when she came to St. Slack, made a note. No, Miss Marple agreed, though I suspect if you investigate thoroughly, you may find they had plans in that direction. As Miss Marple left the police station, she felt a deep weariness settle over her. The case was essentially solved. Ethel would be charged with murder. Dr. Haydock with attempted murder. The Harmon sisters would likely face questioning, but no charges unless evidence emerged of an actual attempt on Helena's life. But the tragedy of it all weighed heavily on her. Helena Vane had orchestrated her own destruction through years of cruelty and manipulation. She had made so many enemies that 3 separate people had tried to kill her, and one had succeeded. In poisoning herself to strengthen her blackmail schemes, she had created the perfect conditions for her own murder. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her garden as the sun set, her knitting in her lap. Mrs. Bantry had stopped by with the latest news. Ethel had been formally charged, Dr. Haydock had made a full confession to Inspector Slack, and Sylvia Fortescue had been completely exonerated. Such a dreadful business, Mrs. Bantry said, shaking her head. To think that poor Ethel was driven to murder out of loyalty. And Doctor? People are capable of extraordinary things when pushed to extremes, Miss Marple said quietly. Helena Vane spent years pushing people to those extremes. I suspect not. A good barrister will argue diminished capacity, loyalty to her mistress, years of faithful service. Miss Marple set down her knitting, and in a strange way, she did solve Mrs. Fortescue's problem. Mrs. Bantry looked shocked. Surely you're not suggesting— I'm suggesting nothing, Miss Marple said firmly. As twilight deepened into night, Miss Marple reflected on the curious case of the woman who had arrived at the garden party, already carrying her death within her. In more ways than one. Helena Vane had poisoned herself, been poisoned by a devoted servant, and narrowly escaped being poisoned by a desperate doctor, all because she had spent her life poisoning the lives of others. There was a kind of terrible symmetry to it, Miss Marple thought. A fitting end, though a tragic one. 3 weeks had passed since the garden party, and St. Mary Mead had settled back into its familiar rhythms, though the events of that June afternoon would be discussed in hushed tones for years to come. The summer house at the vicarage had been thoroughly cleaned and aired, but Miss Marple noticed that no one seemed eager to take tea there any more. She sat in her own garden on a particularly fine morning, the late July sun warm on her face, when Sylvia Fortescue appeared at the gate. The woman looked transformed from the haggard, frightened creature of weeks past. Though still dressed in subdued colours, there was colour in her cheeks and a lightness to her step that had been absent before. Miss Marple, I hope I'm not disturbing you. Please do come in. Sylvia settled into the garden chair with a sigh of relief. The solicitors have finally sorted everything out. Arthur's nephew has been remarkably understanding about the whole business. He's agreed to let me remain at Gossington Hall for as long as I wish, and he's even forgiven the debts Arthur accumulated. It is, and Inspector Slack returned all of Helena's blackmail materials to me yesterday. I burned them in the fireplace, every last letter, every record of payment. Sylvia's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. I'm free, Miss Marple. The trial is set for September. Her barrister is confident he can argue for manslaughter rather than murder. Temporary insanity brought on by loyalty and distress. Sylvia's voice dropped. I visit her every week. She's bearing up remarkably well, all things considered. She keeps apologizing to me. Can you imagine? She acted to protect you, Miss Marple said gently. I've arranged for the best legal representation money can buy. Sylvia paused, looking out over the garden. You know, in a terrible way, Helena's death has given me my life back. It makes you human, Miss Marple replied. Helena Vane constructed her own destruction through years of cruelty. After Sylvia had departed, Miss Marple received another visitor, Dr. Haydock, looking considerably older than he had a month ago. His trial would be later in the year, though his solicitor had indicated that given his confession and the fact that his poison had never actually been consumed by the victim, he might escape with a suspended sentence and the loss of his medical license. "I wanted to apologize," he said, standing awkwardly in her garden. "Sit down, Doctor." He sat heavily, his hands clasped between his knees. "I've been thinking a great deal about choices lately, about the path not taken, the different person I might have been if I'd made different decisions all those years ago." "We cannot change the past," Miss Marple said. He looked up at Miss Marple with haunted eyes. "I took an oath to do no harm, and I violated that oath." "Perhaps there are other ways to heal," Miss Marple suggested. "Other ways to do good in the world." He didn't sound convinced. "Mrs. Moffat has agreed to stay on as my housekeeper, bless her. She says I need looking after now more than ever." After the doctor had left, Miss Marple sat in contemplative silence. The afternoon stretched before her, golden and peaceful, and she found herself thinking about the nature of justice and retribution. Helena Vane had died 3 times in a sense. Once by her own hand through the arsenic she'd been taking, once by Ethel's strychnine, and once by Dr. Haydock's attempted poisoning. Each death had been earned through years of calculated cruelty. Yet Miss Marple felt no satisfaction in the outcome, only a deep sadness for the waste of it all. Lucy Clement appeared at the gate, carrying a basket covered with a checked cloth. "Mother sent you some of her strawberry preserves." "How thoughtful." The girl sat on the edge of a chair, still jumpy and nervous. The discovery of Helena Vane's body had shaken her deeply, robbed her of some essential innocence. "Miss Marple, do you think, is it wicked of me to be glad she's dead?" "Mrs. Vane, She was both victim and perpetrator," Miss Marple said carefully. "She victimized others throughout her life, and in the end became the victim of her own machinations." Lucy was quiet for a moment. "Will things go back to normal now?" "Nothing ever truly goes back to the way it was," Miss Marple said. "We move forward, changed by our experiences, but we do move forward, St." After Lucy had gone, Miss Marple took up her knitting once more. The rhythmic click of the needles was soothing, meditative. She thought about patterns, in knitting, in human behavior, in the way lives intersected and diverged. Helena Vane had been a type she'd encountered many times before, in different guises. The beautiful woman who used her beauty as a weapon, the clever person who used their cleverness for manipulation rather than creation, the damaged soul who chose to damage others rather than heal themselves. And the people of St. Mary Mead were types as well. The loyal servant, the desperate blackmail victim, the wounded lover seeking revenge, the frightened women protecting their hard-won security. All human, all flawed, all capable of both great kindness and great cruelty. As evening approached and the garden filled with lengthening shadows, Miss Marple reflected that this case, like so many others, had ultimately been about fear. Fear of exposure, fear of loss, fear of the past returning to destroy the present. Helena Vane had traded in fear, wielded it like a sword, and in the end it had been fear that killed her. Ethel's fear for her mistress, Dr. Haydock's fear for his reputation. The sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, and Miss Marple watched it with quiet appreciation. Tomorrow, the Harmon sisters would be hosting a tea to benefit the church roof fund. and life would continue its inexorable march forward. The garden party guest who had arrived already dead would become a story, then a memory, then finally just another chapter in the long history of St. Mary Mead. But Miss Marple would remember. She would remember the waste, the tragedy, and the curious way that justice had manifested. Imperfect, messy, but ultimately served. She would remember that human nature was complex and contradictory, capable of both murder and self-sacrifice, often in the same person. And she would continue her quiet observations, her gentle inquiries, her knitting by the window. Because in a world where people were capable of such darkness, someone needed to bear witness to the truth, to understand the patterns, to ensure that justice, in whatever form it took, was recognized and acknowledged. The first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and Miss Marple rose from her chair, gathering her knitting. Inside Soames would have supper ready, and there would be the evening paper to read before bed. Tomorrow would bring its own small dramas and mysteries, as tomorrow always did in St. Mary Mead. But tonight, at least, the truth had been uncovered, and that would have to be enough.